Today I'd like to talk to you about a subject that isn't really mentioned very often, and that is the life cycle of pastoring. Now, we're all familiar with the fact that there's a life cycle to human beings, there's a life cycle to any living organism, and of course many of you are familiar with the fact there's a life cycle to the church. But what we're not familiar with is that there is also a life cycle to pastoring. So how does the life cycle to pastoring start? Well, it goes through 6 phases. The first phase is what we call the honeymoon phase. And the honeymoon phase is very much like the honeymoon phase that we go through when we get married. In the honeymoon phase, we're excited about getting married. We're excited about the person we want to marry. We see the good things in their life. We recognize, of course, that the person we're going to marry certainly has some shortcomings, but we don't really pay much attention to those. Everything looks good, everything looks rosy, everything looks like it's just going to be a marriage that's going to be made in heaven and we'll live happily forever afterward. Now, the same thing happens in the honeymoon phase of a local church. A pastor and a church, they begin to connect with each other through a process. Every denomination is a little bit different, but there's always a process of introducing the pastoral candidate to the local church, and the local church checks up on the pastor checks up on the local church, and there's conversations, there's emails, there's letters, sometimes there's long interviews over phone calls, and then of course eventually the church and the pastor meet. And all through this time, we often think of that as a courting time. It's a time when the pastor puts his best foot forward. The pastor preaches the best sermon that he has. The pastor makes sure that he's on his best behavior every time he's around the church. Now, the church, of course, does the same thing. The church people, they begin to spruce up the facility. They begin to develop the welcoming better. They really put out the best music, particularly today that the pastor's there to candidate and to preach to the church. And so just like in a courtship before marriage, the same thing happens with the local church. The pastoral candidate and the local church, they begin to put their best foot forward and to try and win the affection of the other entity, because they want to see this coming into a marriage. In the case of a pastor in a church, pastor wants to be called or appointed as the pastor. The church, of course, wants to find the next pastor for their church. And then when they get together and the pastor finally comes and starts that first Sunday, the church goes into that phase which we call the honeymoon phase. And just like with a marriage in the honeymoon phase, a pastor sees the church as just the perfect place for him to be. He sees it's the perfect place to minister. It's the church he's always been looking for. And of course, from the church side, they see the pastor as the person that they've always been looking for. And they've never had a better pastor who was a better preacher or a better caregiver or a better evangelist or a better strategist. And so this whole time period is what we call a honeymoon period. The pastor can do no wrong, the church can do no wrong, and to tell you the truth, it's not a realistic situation. We all know that. Pastors are not perfect, churches are not perfect, and we know that even though this first phase seems like it's just a wonderful, blissful time, the reality is that it's just not a realistic and a rational time. And we know that eventually probably the honeymoon period is going to come to an end. Now, for most pastors, the honeymoon phase usually lasts about 1 year. And so let's just put that over here. 1 year is the time when the honeymoon phase lasts. In fact, many pastors will say that just at the beginning of their second year, they began to notice that people treated them differently. And of course, they probably started treating the church a little bit differently too. Now, a honeymoon phase can end sooner, or a honeymoon phase can go a lot longer. I knew one pastor who in his first year, pretty much everything he touched just turned to gold. Everything he did worked. and the people started coming, and his honeymoon phase was extended literally into about the 16th to the 18th month of his tenure in that particular church. But we all know, and we can all rest assured, that eventually the honeymoon phase is going to come to an end. And when the honeymoon phase comes to an end, then we move into what is often called the irritation phase. The irritation phase. Now, the irritation phase, I need to put another R in there. I see I missed that. The irritation phase really begins in most cases around the second year, and will last about that entire second year. Now, what happens in the irritation phase, again, is very much similar to what happens in a marriage. Again, when you first marry someone, neither party can seem to do no wrong, but then over time, things begin to irritate us. For instance, there's jokes when it comes to marriage. There's jokes about how eventually things irritate people in a marriage, like, for instance, do you squeeze the toothpaste from the end, or do you roll it up? Do you have the toilet paper coming off the roll going forward, or do you have the toilet paper roll going off of the roll backwards? Now, these are jokes, and we laugh about them, but behind the jokes is some reality, and that is that in a marriage, over time, we begin to irritate each other. Now, the same thing happens in a local church. There's that honeymoon phase, and the pastor and the church are working together very well. Neither can seem to do no wrong, but over time, gradually, we begin to irritate each other. For example, a number of years ago, I was talking to a pastor, and he told me that during the interview phase, when he was interviewing for the job as the pastor of a local church, the church said to him, "Pastor, it's been our tradition to always give an invitation for salvation at the end of our worship service. Would you be able to continue to do that?" And the pastor related to me that he just simply told them yes. He said that he had never even thought about his perspectives on an altar call, but he just went ahead and told them that yes, he could certainly do that. He could give an invitation at the end of the service. Now, on the other hand, the church had told this pastor that they just couldn't afford to pay him as much money as they wished they could, but they promised that what they would do is that every 6 months they would evaluate his salary, and if it was possible, they would increase his salary just a little bit. Well, eventually the pastor was called by the church, and the pastor accepted the call. And of course, at the beginning, the pastor was always giving an invitation at the end of the worship service, and the pastor looked forward anxiously to that 6-month period when the board would review his salary. Well, the 6 months came, and the board just totally forgot about it. They didn't review his salary. And in about the 8th or 9th month, the pastor began to feel that giving an invitation every Sunday was just not the way he wanted to do things. He began to feel that perhaps the best way to give an invitation was to let the text develop the invitation. Otherwise, if the pastor was preaching, for instance, on husbands love your wives, then the invitation would be the husbands to commit to more love for their wives. Or if the invitation, or if the passage, for instance, was about children obey your parents, then obviously the invitation would be to children to commit to obeying their parents. Otherwise, that the text would form the basis of the invitation. And so gradually, in about the last 4 months of the year, of the honeymoon year, the pastor just began to stop giving invitations for salvation. And of course, at the year mark, the 12-month mark, the pastor anxiously thought, well, the board didn't review my salary in the first 6 months like they said they would, but I'm sure that they'll do it when 12 months comes around. And of course, you know what happened. 12 months came around, the 13th month, the 14th month, the 15th month, and the board just totally forgot about reviewing the pastor's salary. Now, what happened was, of course, is that gradually over time, the people in the church began to get irritated because the pastor was no longer giving an invitation for salvation. They didn't say a lot. They didn't mention it very often, although occasionally when the pastor was shaking hands with people from the church, they would shake hands and they would say, "Pastor, today would have been a good day to give an invitation." And so the pastor knew that the people weren't totally happy with the fact that he wasn't giving an invitation for salvation at the end of every worship service. At the same time, the pastor didn't say anything about the fact that 6 months and another 6 months, 12 months altogether had gone by. The board should have reviewed his salary package twice, and at this point they hadn't done it. In fact, when the 18th month came around, the board still didn't review his salary package, and the pastor was irritated inside. Now, neither the people in the church nor the pastor said much about their irritations. And of course, this is just an illustration. It's a true illustration, but there's other things, of course, that irritate people in churches. Perhaps the pastor's not visiting in the homes as much as the people think the pastor ought to. Perhaps the pastor's not available for a breakfast or a lunch or a dinner as much as the people would like the pastor to be. Maybe the pastor isn't preaching in exactly the way that the people thought that he was going to be preaching. Maybe he's not leading the board or leading the church in the way that the people thought. And so the people begin to get irritated just over a lot of little small things. And of course, the pastor being irritated that the church board didn't review his salary, again, is a real fact, but at the same time, it's just an example. And there's other things that pastors get irritated in. Sometimes, the pastor will come to a church, and in the interviews, the pastor will say, "Well, do you want your church to grow?" And the people, of course, say, "Of course we want our church to grow." And then when the pastor gets there, after about a year or a year and a half of trying to initiate change and new ideas in the church and getting resisted a lot, what happens is that the pastor begins to get irritated because the church said they were interested in growth, but the church is resisting all of his change initiatives. The pastor asked the people if they're interested in leading people to faith in Christ, and the people, of course, said, "Oh yes, we want people to come to faith in Christ." But when the pastor during that first year tried to initiate a new program of evangelistic training, only one person showed up, and the pastor was irritated by that. Now, people and pastor don't say a lot about these irritations because, after all, we're Christians. We ought to love one another. We ought to, bear with one another. And so pastors and churches just don't talk too much about these irritations. But what happens is that the irritations actually begin to build up. And so, essentially what happens is that both the pastor and the church build what they call a bank of irritations. And if you'll bear with me here for just a minute, I'm going to show you my artistic ability, and this is a bank of irritations. And so what you do is you have the pastor here who is working, with the church, and we'll just do the church like that. Of course, we know that the church is people, but just for illustrations, in that second year, irritations begin to rise up, and as the pastor gets irritated, the pastor puts the irritation in the bank, and then puts the irritation in the bank, and over time, different levels, different numbers of irritations begin to get built up in the pastor's bank of irritations. Now, of course, the church also has a bank of irritations. And there's, looks very similar to that of the pastor. So as the pastor begins to irritate the people in the church, then the people begin to bank their irritations. The pastor didn't give an invitation for salvation. The pastor didn't visit my mother when she was sick at home. The pastor didn't establish a good budget this year. The pastor's sermon wasn't as good as we expected that the pastor would give. And so it goes on and on, of course, but the church then banks its irritations. And so in the second year of the honeymoon, basically we have this irritation phase where the pastor irritates the church irritates the pastor, but because of the Christian love and desire for bearing with one another, not much is said about these irritations. Well, then that leads us into what some have called the conflict stage. And the conflict stage, or the conflict phase, usually takes place in about the third to the fourth year. Third to the fourth year. And usually this is seen when some decision is made that goes against what the pastor wants. For instance, in one pastor that I know was relating to me how he began to develop a plan for a new building program in the church, and he involved the elders in the decision making. He involved the leaders in the church in the decision making, and they did a lot of discussion. They looked at properties with the realtor. Everything seemed to be fine. In fact, as they were developing the strategy to take this to the congregation, the pastor actually went around the room and said to each elder, "Are you for this? Yes or no? Are you for this? Yes or no?" And every one of the elders said that they were for it. Well, the time went on, and they developed a presentation to the congregation, because the congregation had to have a say, a vote, in whether or not they would purchase the new property. And when it came to the day of the vote, the congregation voted no. And not only did the congregation vote no, but in the weeks that followed, the pastor began to hear rumors that even some of the elders had voted no. Even after he had already gone around the room at one time and asked them if they were for it, they all said they were. But when it came to the vote, the church and even some of the elders voted against this particular move to purchase this new property. Now, what was happening there is that the church was saying, we are saying no to what you as the pastor see as the vision or the direction for our church in the future. And so what happens is you enter into this conflict phase. Again, it usually happens in about the third to the fourth year. Now, again, if the honeymoon phase has been extensive, maybe if the honeymoon phase has gone into the second year, maybe the irritation phase doesn't begin until maybe the middle of the second year or the end of the second year, which would push off the conflict usually to about the fourth or maybe the fifth year. So it varies from church situation to church situation, and of course from pastor to pastor. But the truth is that eventually there comes a point in time where the congregation basically says to the pastor, "We're not going to follow you anymore." And so by conflict, I don't mean that there is an out-and-out battle in the church, but it's just a point in time when the church says, you know, the irritations have gotten so large in our bank that we have decided that we're not going to follow you anymore. Now, sometimes what happens is that the leaders get together to discuss why the vote didn't go through. But at that point, in the discussion, is when people in the church go into their bank and they begin to pull out of the bank their irritations. And they'll say, "Well, Pastor, we voted against buying that property in part because over the years you haven't followed through on your commitments. My mother was in the hospital and you didn't visit her. You didn't visit in the homes as much as we thought. Your sermons have gone down in quality and we haven't appreciated that." And on and on and on, they pull out of the bank their irritations. Of course, in defense then, what the pastor often does is go to the pastor's bank of irritations and begins to pull out of there and say, "Well, you said that you would evaluate my salary every 6 months, and you didn't this first 6 months, you didn't the next 6 months, 18 months you didn't, 24 months you didn't." And so the pastor begins to pull out those frustrations. The pastor will say, "Well, when I came here, you said that you were interested in church growth, but every time I bring a change initiative to the board, you resist it. You aren't willing to grow. Oh, and by the way, you also said you were interested in outreach and evangelism, but when I've tried to train you, no one shows up." And so what happens is there is this point where the frustrations of both the pastor and the congregation become so great that ministry stops, and it's usually stopped over some sort of a major decision or a major vote. And then as the church and the pastor discuss these things, they both pull out of their banks of irritations to support their causes. Now, they all know that this is wrong. They all know that it's not good to pile up grievances in their banks of irritations. And as Christians, basically after they discuss this for a while, they begin to apologize to one another. They begin to ask forgiveness of one another. And they say, you know, let's just try harder. So what happens is then the church moves into what we think of as the work harder phase. The work harder phase. And the work harder phase usually takes place in about the 5th year. And what happens is that the pastor decides, well, I'll just work harder to shore up the grievances, to help eliminate the grievances that the church has. So it's true, I haven't been visiting the elderly people as much as I have. So the pastor begins to work harder at visiting the elderly people, work harder at visiting in the hospital. And then the pastor might say, you know, it's true, I've been so busy doing other things in that building program that I kind of let my sermon preparation slip, so I'll work harder at my sermon preparation. And so the pastor throws himself into, we're just working harder and harder and harder, because the pastor essentially wants to eliminate these irritations that have arisen in the people's bank. And of course, in some cases, the church will say, Pastor, you're right. You know, we did promise that we would evaluate your salary every 6 months, and we haven't done that. So, Pastor, we're so sorry, we will evaluate your salary. And so the church begins to work harder. Pastor, you're right. You know, we didn't come out when you had that evangelistic training. Pastor, we have been kind of resistant to change. And so sometimes the church will work harder. But even if the church doesn't work harder, typically what happens is that the pastor begins to work harder and harder. And of course what this leads to eventually is what we think of as the exhaustion phase. The exhaustion phase. And the exhaustion phase usually happens in the 6th year. That the pastor, because the pastor's been working harder, the pastor has typically not delegated responsibility away. The pastor has not shed himself of all the responsibilities he's been carrying. He simply added responsibilities, added work to his already busy load. And so as the pastor has worked harder at visitation, worked harder at working with the board, I worked harder at teaching and preaching, basically over time what happens is the pastor just begins to get exhausted, begins to get tired. And what that leads to, of course, is the last phase in the life cycle of pastor. And the last phase of the life cycle of pastor, of course, then is the separation phase. The separation phase. And this usually happens in about the 7th year. And what happens, of course, is that the pastor wants to get away from that which exhausts him. And see, here's what actually happens. The exhaustion phase is the opposite of the honeymoon phase. So these two phases, the exhaustion phase and the honeymoon phase, are exactly opposite. Remember earlier we were talking about the fact that in the honeymoon phase that everything looks beautiful, everything looks wonderful. Well, now in the exhaustion phase, when a pastor is tired, everything looks bad, everything looks terrible. So up here in the honeymoon phase, these people were wonderful, but down here in the exhaustion phase, these people are just obstinate people who are not willing to commit and sacrifice for the Lord. Up here in the honeymoon phase, this church is the place I've been looking for. It is the type of church I've been praying for. Down here, this church is a resistant church. It's a church that doesn't want to grow. And so what happens is that just like the honeymoon phase is not realistic, neither is the exhaustion phase realistic. But when you're tired, you begin to see things through the lenses of tired glasses, so to speak, and so that everything looks negative, everything looks bad. And when you look around the church, nothing looks like it has potential, nothing looks like it has hope. It just hasn't panned out to be what you expected it to be when you came into the honeymoon phase. And so what happens in this exhaustion phase is a pastor begins to think about another place of ministry, because when you're exhausted, you want to get away from that which exhausts you. And so eventually you go into the separation phase. Now, in the United States, the average pastorate is only about 3 to 4 years long. So what happens here, if we can take, and let me get a pen with a slightly different color here just to emphasize this, but somewhere right in here is where we see the, let me change pens again there. Here we go, this will be better. Right in here is where most pastorates tend to end. Most pastorates on average end about in the 3rd or the 4th year. Now, if the average pastorate's about 3 to 4 years, what that means is that there's a lot of pastorates that last longer than 4 years, and a lot of pastorates that last shorter than 4 years. One church I consulted with a number of years had 3 pastors in 2 years. And yet we've all known of some churches that have these extraordinarily long pastorates of 30, 40 years. Of those of course are not very many, but there are some of those. But most pastorates in general tend to last probably somewhere around 4 or 5 years, somewhere in that range. So what happens in most churches is, even though I've said that this happens in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th year, what happens in most churches is that the work harder phase, the exhaustion phase, and the separation phase all happens before about the 4th year. Otherwise, the honeymoon may last only maybe a few months, and then the irritation phase begins, and maybe the irritation phase kicks in maybe at least by the middle of the 1st year, and then the conflict arises in the 3rd year, and the pastor works harder, becomes exhausted, and then leaves by the 4th year. So this is the life cycle of pastoring in the United States. It may not be this way in other countries of the world, but in the United States we see this happening over and over again. Now the sad thing is that what happens is when a pastor separates, then what a pastor typically does is goes to a new church. And when the pastor goes to a new church, what happens is that you start all over with the honeymoon phase, go through the irritation phase, go through the conflict phase, the work harder phase, the exhaustion phase, the separation phase, and then do it all over again, and go to another church and just do the cycle all over again. I remember years ago when I was a young pastor, there were a number of us, one of our senior pastors in our particular association of churches was retiring after 40 years of ministry. And I remember when we went to the retirement dinner, there were 3 of us who were younger pastors with our wives, and we were all sitting at one table because we were close friends, partly due to our age at the time. And so as we were sitting there at the table, they were giving all the accolades to this senior pastor who was retiring after 40 years of ministry. Eventually they allowed him to get up and to speak to the group there. And in his talk, he said to the entire group, he said, it's been a wonderful 40 years of ministry, and I want you to know that I am really appreciative of the 10 churches to which I was able to be the pastor. And those of us who were sitting at the table, the younger guys, we kind of whispered to each other and we said, you know, he really hasn't had 40 years of ministry. He's had 4 years of ministry 10 times. And that's exactly what had happened here. He had gone to 10 churches. He had had 10 honeymoons, 10 irritation phases, 10 conflict phases, and then very quickly he had done the work harder phase, exhaustion phase, and the separation phase, and moved on. And he had done that 10 times in a 40-year career. So the question is, how can we keep this from happening? Because we know that church growth studies have shown that pastors do not reach their most effective years till the 6th or 7th year. And if pastors are really going to see changes happen in a church, if they're going to see turnaround happen, if they're going to see growth happen, biblical church growth happen in a local church, they've got to stay beyond the 6th or the 7th year in a church. Well, I can think of a number of things. Maybe you can think of a few others, and so, you know, begin to write those down now. How could you stop this from happening? Let me just mention a couple of things. One thing that I've often thought of is that during the interview time, before the honeymoon phase even begins, before you're even called or appointed to a church, we need to be more open and to be more honest to the churches when, as pastors, we are interviewing and going through that process. Now, sometimes when you're a young pastor and you go through an interview process, you don't really know what you believe about your philosophy of ministry yet. You know, you may have been through Bible school, Bible college, seminary, and you have some knowledge, but usually when you're younger, you really don't have a completely thought out philosophy of ministry. And so when you're going through the interview phase, you don't know exactly what to say or what to agree to. But particularly as you get older, you know more about how you preach and what you think about things like, for instance, an altar call and a visitation and evangelism and those sorts of things. And what we have to do is to be more open, to be more honest in the interview process, realizing, of course, that our openness may mean that the church doesn't select us to be their pastor, but that's okay. What we want to do is find a place that fits us, and when we fit the church and the church fits us in terms of our not only our theology, which is important, of course, but also our philosophy of ministry, then we're going to see much more success and fruitfulness in our ministry. So that's one thing I can think of, is to avoid this irritation phase, is just to be more honest up here in the phase of interviewing with people. But then another thing I can think of, and this may be a little more difficult in some cases, is when irritations arise, we don't want to simply put them in our banks, whether it's us as the pastor or the church. What we should do instead is that we should have a conversation. If this pastor who was irritated at 6 months because the church had not evaluated his salary, at the very next board meeting, like in the 7th month, he should have brought that up. He should have said to the board members, you know, I don't mean to bring up issues of money, but you did say you would evaluate my salary, and I would appreciate it if you would do it. I think the church probably would have responded fine to that. They would have recognized that, yes, they did promise, and they had neglected to do that. On the other hand, if the people in the church were irritated because the pastor wasn't giving an invitation for salvation, then someone should have approached the pastor, either personally or perhaps the board should have approached the pastor and said, Pastor, we just need to have a conversation. You said that you would give an invitation for salvation, and now you stopped doing that. What's up? What's happening? That would allow the pastor to kind of share his developing philosophy of altar calls, and at least they could have had a discussion. Discussion helps eliminate the irritations if we talk about it and seek to come to a resolution of the issue. If we don't do that, then simply what happens is that the irritations pile up in the bank, and it's much like a pressure cooker. They're just gradually beginning to build pressure, and then when this conflict arises over whatever issue it happens to be, then that allows for the irritation the banks to kind of explode under the pressure of all this mounting irritation. If we can talk about it, if we can share with each other along the way, that will help relieve the pressure. And when we do have these moments of conflict, these moments of showdown over larger issues in the church, they won't be quite as dynamic because we will have eliminated the frustrations ahead of time. That's the life cycle of pastoring. Where are you on your life cycle of pastoring? And what can you do to deal with the irritations that are rising in your church so that you don't have the work harder phase, the exhaustion phase, and the separation phase? God bless you.